If you had told me 3 years ago that my own mother would stand in the doorway of my childhood home and tell me I was no longer welcome there, I would have laughed. Not because it was funny, because I would have thought you were describing another family. Not mine. My name is Emily Carter, and I grew up in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew when your driveway got repaved, when your dog went missing, and when your Christmas lights stayed up too long. My father, Daniel Carter, worked as an electrician for almost 40 years. My mother, Linda, was a school secretary. We weren't rich. We weren't poor. We were just a normal American family. At least, that's what I believed. I had an older brother named Jason. Jason was the golden child. He was charming, confident, the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave 20 minutes later with everybody thinking he was their best friend. I was different. Quiet. Responsible. I didn't ask for much. And because I didn't ask for much, my family slowly started believing I didn't deserve much. My father always told me something when I was growing up. Emily, never depend on anybody. Build something that belongs to you. I remembered those words every time life became difficult, and I followed them. I worked. I saved. I went to college. I built a career. And when I was 29, I bought my first small house. But the house where my story really began wasn't mine. It belonged to my parents. The old Carter house. The house with the blue front door. The house where my father planted an apple tree when I was 7. The house where my mother measured my height against the kitchen wall. The house where Jason and I fought over the television. And the house where I thought my family would always have a place for me. Until one Saturday afternoon, my mother looked directly at me and said, "Emily, you need to understand something." I was standing in the kitchen. Jason was sitting at the dining table. My mother had a folder in her hands. My father wasn't there. I remember looking at the folder and asking, "What is that?" Mom didn't answer immediately. She put it on the table. Then she said, "Your father and I have decided to leave the house to Jason." I stared at her. I actually laughed. I thought it was a joke. "Okay," Mom didn't smile. "Jason is going to move in." My brother looked down at his coffee. I looked back at my mother. "And where am I supposed to go?" She sighed. "You have your own house, Emily." That sentence hurt more than it should have, because I knew what she really meant. You don't belong here anymore. I looked around the kitchen. The old refrigerator, the wooden cabinets, the little scratch on the counter where I had dropped a glass when I was 16. My whole childhood was sitting around me, and suddenly I felt like a stranger. Then Jason finally spoke. "Emily, nobody's kicking you out." I looked at him. "You just said you're moving in." He shrugged. "Mom and Dad are getting older. Somebody needs to take care of them." I almost smiled. Because for the last 5 years, I had been the one taking care of them. I drove Dad to his medical appointments. I paid their property tax one winter when Dad's business slowed down. I fixed Mom's broken computer. I bought groceries. I called every Sunday. Jason lived 4 states away. He visited twice a year. Yet somehow he was the one who was taking care of them. I looked at my mother. "Is this what Dad wants?" Her eyes moved away from mine, and that was when I knew something was wrong. I stood up. "Where is Dad?" Mom said quietly. "He's upstairs." I walked toward the staircase. Jason suddenly stood. "Emily." I stopped. He said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I turned around, and I said something I had never said to my brother before. "Jason, you have no idea how hard I've already made it for myself so everyone else could have an easier life." Then I walked upstairs. My father's bedroom door was half open. I knocked. No answer. I entered. Dad was sitting beside the window. He looked older than I remembered. His hands were resting on his knees. I sat beside him. "Dad," he looked at me. His eyes were wet. I whispered, "Did you agree to this?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached toward the nightstand, and he pulled out a small white envelope. My name was written on it, Emily Carter. I looked at him. "What is this?" He closed his fingers around my hand. Then he said 5 words that I still remember exactly. "Don't open this until I'm gone." I stared at him. "Dad, what are you talking about?" He shook his head. "Promise me." I didn't understand, but I promised. 3 months later, my father died, and that envelope changed everything. Dad died on a rainy Tuesday morning. There was no dramatic goodbye, no movie scene, no final speech. He simply stopped breathing while my mother held his hand. I was sitting on the other side of the bed. Jason wasn't there. He was flying in from Denver. I remember staring at Dad's face and thinking about all the little things I had taken for granted. His terrible jokes. His old work boots. The way he complained about the thermostat. The way he called me kiddo, even though I was 37 years old. At the funeral, Jason gave the speech. He talked about Dad's work ethic. His generosity, his love for the family. Everyone cried. I cried too, but I noticed something. Jason never mentioned the years Dad was sick. He never mentioned the appointments. He never mentioned the bills. He never mentioned the nights I sat beside Dad when he couldn't sleep. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he didn't know, or maybe he didn't want anyone to know. After the funeral, Mom came to me. "Emily, your father would want us to stay close." I nodded. "I know." She hugged me. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Then Jason arrived. He waited exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, he brought up the house. "I think we need to discuss Dad's estate." I looked at him. "What about it?" He said, "Mom wants me to handle everything." I looked at Mom. She nodded. "I think Jason is better at these things." That sentence stayed with me, not because it was insulting, because it confirmed something. My family had already chosen a side. I didn't argue. I didn't fight. I went home. For 2 weeks, I tried to grieve. Then one evening, Mom called me. "Emily?" "Yeah, I found some paperwork in your father's office." My heart stopped. "What paperwork?" There was silence. Then she said, "Something about the house." I sat down. "What about it?" "I don't understand it." "Can I see it?" Another silence. Then she said, "No." I frowned. "Why?" "Because Jason says it's complicated." I almost laughed. "Mom, I'm an accountant. I understand paperwork." She became defensive. I said no. That night I couldn't sleep. At 2:13 in the morning, I remembered the envelope. The envelope Dad had given me, the one with my name on it. The one he told me not to open until he was gone. He was gone. I went downstairs. I opened the drawer beside my bed. The envelope was still there. I held it for almost 5 minutes. Then I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter, Dad's handwriting. The first line said, "Emily, if you're reading this, I'm no longer there to protect you." I stopped breathing. I continued. "I need you to know something your mother and brother may never tell you." My hands started shaking. Then I read the next sentence. "The house was never supposed to belong to Jason." I read it again and again. Then I found something else inside the envelope. A key, a small brass key, and a note, "Look behind the old furnace in the basement." I sat there at 2 in the morning holding that key. I didn't know what it opened, but I knew one thing. My father had been preparing me for something my family didn't want me to discover. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house. Mom wasn't home. Jason was there. He opened the door. "What are you doing here?" I said, "I need to get some of Dad's things." He crossed his arms. "Like what?" "Personal stuff." He stared at me, then he stepped aside. "Fine." I walked downstairs. The basement smelled exactly the way it always had. Dust, old wood, machine oil. Dad's workbench was still there. His tools were hanging on the wall. I walked toward the furnace. Behind it was a wooden panel. I had never noticed it before. I moved it. There was a small metal box. The brass key fit perfectly. I opened it. Inside were documents, bank statements, property records, old receipts, and photographs. I picked up the first photograph. It was Dad standing outside the house, but something was written on the back. "Purchased July 1998 for Emily." I froze. For me, I picked up another document. It was the original property agreement. My father had purchased the house 28 years earlier, but there was a handwritten clause. The house was supposed to be transferred to me when I turned 35. I was 37. I read it again. Then I found a second document, a notarized letter. Dad had changed the ownership structure. Not to Jason, to me. My name was on the paperwork. I felt dizzy. Why had Dad never told me? Then I found the answer, a medical document, and another letter. This one was dated 2 years earlier. Dad had written, "Linda believes Jason needs this house because he has struggled financially. She doesn't know I have already protected Emily's future." I sat on the basement floor, and suddenly all those years made sense. Dad hadn't been ignoring what was happening. He had been watching. He knew Jason was borrowing money. He knew Jason had debt. He knew Jason had lied about his business. And Dad had been trying to protect the family without destroying his son. Then I found something that made my stomach turn. A bank statement. There had been large withdrawals from my parents' account. Thousands of dollars, month after month. The money had gone to Jason. I looked at the dates. Some of those transfers had happened while Dad was in the hospital. I took pictures of every document. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. Jason. I quickly put everything back. He appeared at the basement door. "What are you doing down here?" "Looking for Dad's tools." He stared at me. "You don't need to come down here anymore." I looked at him. "Why?" "Because Mom and I are organizing the house." I stood up. "Jason, it's still Mom's house." He stepped closer. "You heard what Mom said." I smiled. "What did she say?" "That you're not part of this anymore." Something inside me finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. It simply stopped hurting. I walked upstairs. Mom was standing in the kitchen when I arrived. She looked nervous. I said, "Mom, did Dad ever tell you who the house belongs to?" She went pale. Jason walked into the kitchen behind me. Neither of them answered. And that was my answer. I said, "Okay." Mom whispered, "Emily." I held up my hand. "Don't." Then I walked out. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to convince my family that I deserved to belong. Instead, I decided to find out exactly what my father had left me. 2 days later, I met with Dad's old attorney. His name was Michael Harris. He had known my father for 20 years. I placed the documents on his desk. He looked at them. Then he looked at me. "Where did you get these?" "Dad left them for me." Michael leaned back. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he whispered, "Your father knew this day was coming." My heart sank. "What day?" "The day you would finally learn the truth." He opened a file. Inside was my father's official estate plan. And there it was, the house, my name, my inheritance, everything. But there was something else. Michael said, "Your father created a trust for you." I stared at him. "A trust?" "Yes." "How much?" He hesitated. "Enough to make sure you never have to depend on your family again." I couldn't speak. But I wasn't thinking about the money. I was thinking about Dad. Why had he hidden this from me? Michael answered before I asked. "Your father didn't want money to change your relationship with your family." I laughed sadly. "Well, that didn't work." Michael looked at me. "There is something else." He opened another file. "Your father documented several loans he gave Jason." I stared at the papers. Michael continued. "Some were never repaid." "How much?" He gave me the number. I felt sick. Jason owed Dad more than $86,000, but Dad had never demanded it back. He had written one sentence beside the final loan. "A father doesn't always lend money because he expects repayment." I wiped my eyes. Dad had protected Jason too, even when Jason didn't deserve it. Then Michael showed me one final document, a letter Dad had instructed him to deliver to me after his death. I opened it. It said, "Emily, don't use what I left you to punish your brother." I stopped reading. That sentence hurt, because Dad knew me. He knew I would be angry. He knew I would want revenge. Then I read the next line. "Use it to build the life you were always too busy building for everyone else." I started crying. Not because of the money, because my father had finally said what nobody else ever had. He had seen me all those years. He had seen everything. The sacrifices. The phone calls, the quiet help. The times I said I'm fine when I wasn't. The times I paid bills and never mentioned it. Dad had seen it. And now he was gone. When I left the attorney's office, I had a choice. I could expose Jason. I could fight my mother. I could force the family to admit they had treated me unfairly, or I could walk away. I chose something I didn't expect. I went back to the house. Mom was sitting alone in the living room. Jason wasn't there. I sat beside her. She looked at me. I know about the house, I said, her eyes filled with tears. I know, I stared at her. You knew, she nodded. I knew your father wanted it for you. Then why did you tell me Jason was getting it? She covered her face. And when she finally spoke, I heard something I had never heard from my mother before. Fear, because I was scared. Of what? Of losing Jason. I didn't understand. She continued. Your brother threatened to leave. He said he would never speak to me again if he didn't get the house. I stared at her. So you chose him? She cried. I thought you would understand. I shook my head. No, Mom. My voice was quiet. I understand exactly what you did. 3 weeks later, I asked everyone to come to the house. Mom, Jason, my Aunt Susan, and Michael, Dad's attorney. Nobody knew why. Jason arrived angry. What is this? I looked at him. It's about Dad. He sat down. Mom looked terrified. Michael placed a folder on the table. I didn't touch it. I simply said, Dad left instructions. Jason laughed. Dad's dead. He doesn't get to control what happens now. Michael looked at him. Yes, he does. The room went silent. Michael explained the legal documents. The house belonged to me. The trust belonged to me. The property could not be transferred to Jason. Jason's face turned red. You're lying. Michael pushed the document toward him. Read it. Jason looked at Mom. You knew. She began crying. The phone calls, the quiet help. The times I said I'm fine when I wasn't. The times I paid bills and never mentioned it. Dad had seen it. And now he was gone. When I left the attorney's office, I had a choice. I could expose Jason. I could fight my mother. I could force the family to admit they had treated me unfairly, or I could walk away. I chose something I didn't expect. I went back to the house. Mom was sitting alone in the living room. Jason wasn't there. I sat beside her. She looked at me. I know about the house, I said, her eyes filled with tears. I know. I stared at her. You knew, she nodded. I knew your father wanted it for you. Then why did you tell me Jason was getting it? She covered her face. And when she finally spoke, I heard something I had never heard from my mother before. Fear, because I was scared. Of what? Of losing Jason. I didn't understand. She continued. Your brother threatened to leave. He said he would never speak to me again if he didn't get the house. I stared at her. So you chose him? She cried. I thought you would understand. I shook my head. No, Mom. My voice was quiet. I understand exactly what you did. 3 weeks later, I asked everyone to come to the house. Mom, Jason, my Aunt Susan, and Michael, Dad's attorney. Nobody knew why. Jason arrived angry. What is this? I looked at him. It's about Dad. He sat down. Mom looked terrified. Michael placed a folder on the table. I didn't touch it. I simply said, Dad left instructions. Jason laughed. Dad's dead. He doesn't get to control what happens now. Michael looked at him. Yes, he does. The room went silent. Michael explained the legal documents. The house belonged to me. The trust belonged to me. The property could not be transferred to Jason. Jason's face turned red. You're lying. Michael pushed the document toward him. Read it. Jason looked at Mom. You knew. She began crying. I was trying to keep the family together. Jason laughed bitterly. You chose her. Mom shook her head. No, your father chose her. Jason looked at me. And for the first time, I saw something different in his face. Not anger, fear. He whispered, What are you going to do? I could have destroyed him. I had enough information. The bank records, the unpaid loans, the lies, the business debt. I could have made sure everyone knew, but I remembered Dad's letter. Don't use what I left you to punish your brother, so I said, nothing. Jason looked confused. What? I don't want your money. He stared at me. I don't want your apology. His face changed. I don't want you to thank me. I took a breath. But I want you to leave Mom alone. Jason looked at our mother. I continued. She doesn't owe you the house. Nobody spoke. Then Jason quietly sat down. For several minutes there was only silence. Finally he said, I was jealous of you. I looked at him. He continued. Dad always trusted you. I almost laughed. Jason, Dad spent years trying to save you. I know. His voice cracked. I know now. Then he told us something I never expected. He had lost his business. He was drowning in debt. He had been pretending everything was fine. And when Dad refused to give him the house, Jason had pressured Mom. He thought if Mom chose him, Dad would eventually give in. But Dad never did. Jason looked at me. "I thought you had everything." I said, "I thought you did." We both laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh people make when they finally realize how wrong they were about each other. That evening, after everyone left, I stayed in the house alone. I walked into Dad's workshop. His old boots were still beside the door. I sat on his workbench, and I cried, not because I had won, because there was nobody left to tell.